welcome to Twitchell Auditorium and the Spartanburg Philharmonic's 92nd season. We are delighted to be presenting our first ever digital program entitled Ludwig, Heroes in Revolution. This year is the 250th anniversary of Ludwig van Beethoven's birth, and orchestras the world over are celebrating by performing his incredible and revolutionary music. In fact, Beethoven was deeply affected by the American Revolution. The formation of our new government for the people and by the people inspired the French Revolution and the formation of republics and democracies across Europe throughout Beethoven's lifetime. This program is also inspired by the present-day revolution aimed at ending the systemic racism and discrimination that has permeated our industry. The Spartanburg Philharmonic, along with the League of American Orchestras, is swiftly moving towards absolute diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so, we begin our commitment and this program with music written by a contemporary of Beethoven's, who is just now receiving the recognition they've deserved for more than 200 years. Joseph Bologna, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, not only had the coolest name of any composer that ever lived, he also was a champion fencer, violin virtuoso, and conductor of the leading orchestras in Paris. He wrote operas, symphonies, violin concertos, and a lot of chamber music. During the French Revolution, he fought on the side of the Republic, serving as a colonel in the first all-black regiment in Europe. This past July, the New York Times published a fascinating article about Joseph Bologna, written by the Brazilian-American composer and writer Marcos Balter, where he succinctly stated, quote, "It is a remarkable fact that Bologna's music has survived 2 centuries of neglect caused by the systemic racism that permeates the notion of a Western canon. Neither his omission from music history textbooks, nor a lack of advocacy from programmers, publishing houses, and record labels have erased him completely." Let's watch the Philharmonic play just a little bit of the second movement of Bologna's First Symphony. If one didn't know the composer of that music and was asked to guess who it was, names like Franz Joseph Haydn or Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart certainly come to mind. In fact, it was Bologna who commissioned and premiered Haydn's Paris symphonies. And it is with the symphonies of Haydn that we can really begin to talk about and understand Beethoven. As many of us know, Beethoven gradually lost his hearing and still went on to compose his greatest symphonies, concertos, sacred music, chamber music, one opera, and solo piano music that plumbed the depths of musical form and self-expression. But it is the symphony, and in particular Beethoven's Third Symphony, where he really revolutionized music forever. A little context might be in order to better understand what we mean. The symphony, as a multi-movement piece of music, was first deeply explored by Haydn in the second half of the 18th century. In fact, Haydn wrote 104 symphonies, many of them for the court, where he was employed by a music-loving prince named Nicholas Esterhazy. It was at the Esterhazy Palace that Haydn had his own sort of laboratory for music. He had an orchestra and singers at his disposal, but most importantly, he had a captive audience. Let's listen to a typical symphony from Haydn's time at Esterhazy. This is the first movement of his Symphony number 89. symmetrical phrases, one steady tempo, not too much contrast in volume or orchestral color. One could easily listen attentively to this music as have it serve as a sort of background entertainment for a courtly function. The point being, this music communicates one single affect, let's say in this case, jubilation. But beyond this affect, there isn't much more. And the reason Haydn wrote this music was because it was essentially part of his job as the court composer to churn out music that entertained and pleased his courtly audience. In fact, the job of court composer was, as we musicians say, a pretty sweet gig, one that eluded the other great composer from this time, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Mozart was never able to land the court composer position and was forced to work on commission. It's a good thing he was a genius, writing music for a multitude of occasions, often at an incredibly fast pace. For example, his opera, The Marriage of Figaro, was written in only 6 weeks. Like Haydn, Mozart also wrote symphonies, most of them on commission. However, his last 3 symphonies, numbers 39, 40, and 41, were not commissioned. These last 3 symphonies were written in the summer of 1788 for no known reason other than what inspired him to do so. And the Symphony number 40 in particular communicates something beyond what Haydn and even Mozart had written before in his symphonies. Let's watch the orchestra play a couple of minutes from the famous first movement of Mozart's Symphony number 40 in G minor. Different from Haydn. It didn't stay in one place. It's as if the music took us on a sort of journey from dark to light. It almost feels like the music could be about something. I've always thought that what made Mozart so special was the intensity of the human elements in his music. In this case, the journey the music takes us on. From the opening gloominess to the ending's elation, the music speaks a more human, emotional language. Both Mozart and Haydn had significant influences on Beethoven. In fact, Beethoven, at the age of 17, moved to Vienna from his hometown of Bonn to study with Mozart. Sadly, as soon as he arrived, the death of his mother called him back to Bonn, and in 1791, Mozart died. The following year, in 1792, Beethoven returned to Vienna, this time to study with Haydn. It was a success for a little while. Ultimately, Beethoven had to find his own way in Vienna, and it was on his instrument, the piano, that he really began to gain notoriety. Beethoven first made impressions with the Viennese music-loving aristocrats by engaging in piano duels, believe it or not, where two pianists would actually compete against one another. A musical theme or melody would be prescribed to the competitors, and the duel would begin, with each of them taking turns improvising variations on that given theme. The musician who displayed the most invention and virtuosity was declared the winner. Beethoven's success as a piano virtuoso opened doors for him and led to his very first commissioned and published work. His first opus was a set of 3 trios for piano, violin, and cello, written in 1795. Haydn actually attended their very first performance and praised the first 2 trios, but warned Beethoven not to publish the third, believing that it was too advanced for audiences. Here's an excerpt from the first movement of Beethoven's first published work, Opus 1, number 3, in C minor. Beethoven's romantic angst was already beginning to show in his earliest works. As to Haydn's warning about not publishing the third trio, Beethoven declared that Haydn was just jealous. And maybe Beethoven was right, because Haydn did ask Beethoven to indicate on the cover page of the piece that he was his pupil. That didn't happen. Here's another example of Beethoven's early period, the beautiful slow movement from his Piano Sonata number 8, that the work's publisher named the Pathétique Sonata. This music is the opposite of brooding, rather calming the listener and creating a place for contemplation and pleasant reflection. Let's watch Philharmonic board member and Spartanburg County music educator Misha Adderley play some of the beautiful slow movement from the Pathétique Sonata. Simply gorgeous music. Beethoven, in his early period, developed a range of affects and emotions that started to separate his music from other composers. Because of the political revolutions and subsequent changes to the socio-political environment, 2 markets for music started to emerge, one for a music-loving amateur class and the other for a music-loving noble class, the latter of which championed Beethoven. With this newfound financial support, Beethoven was encouraged by his patrons to continue developing his imaginative style. At last, Beethoven had the courage and much-needed financial backing to compose a large symphonic work, his first symphony in C major from 1800. From the very first notes, his symphony was remarkably different than anything that came before. Let's watch the introduction of the first movement and notice a couple of things. Firstly, it's almost like Beethoven is joking around as to when the piece actually begins, with these two opening statements and abrupt pauses. And secondly, it takes the entirety of this slow introduction to establish what key this piece is going to be in. Let's watch. While audiences in 1800 certainly noticed these peculiarities, Beethoven's circle of acquaintances began noticing peculiarities in his behavior. The onset of tinnitus was making for awkward social and professional interactions. The unthinkable was beginning to become more and more real. He was losing his hearing. One of Beethoven's most famous piano sonatas, the Moonlight Sonata, was written at this time, and like Mozart's late symphonies, there was no commission for this work. Perhaps the French Romantic composer Hector Berlioz said it best when describing the Moonlight Sonata, quote, "It is one of those poems that human language does not know how to qualify." Let's watch Brennan Schaffron play some of the first movement of the Moonlight Sonata. Perhaps the sadness and graveness in this music, with its fragmented and distant melody, is Beethoven bringing the listener into what he was experiencing and feeling as he confronted the reality of his own hearing loss. Shortly after the Moonlight Sonata was written, Beethoven, at his lowest point, penned a letter to his family. In this letter, he talks of his utter despair and hopelessness, writing, "What misery when those beside me heard a flute in the distance and I heard nothing. Or when others heard a shepherd singing in the field and I heard nothing. Such things have brought me to the edge of despair and have nearly caused me to end my life. Art," he exclaimed, "art alone saved me. How could I possibly quit the world before bringing forth all that I felt was my duty to produce?" From then on, Beethoven accepted his deafness and vowed to not let it define him, Rather, he set out on a new path to live through and for his art. Molded by the Revolution and its motto of liberty, equality, and fraternity, Beethoven turned to his personal hero of the Revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte, for the inspiration to write a new symphony. This work, larger in scope than any previous symphony, sought to depict the entire range of emotions associated with the path to heroism. Conviction, determination, struggle, sorrow, revelation, victory, all can be heard in this incredible Third Symphony. Though the original title of the symphony was simply Bonaparte, history has since inserted Beethoven himself as the work's real hero. In 1804, when Napoleon declared himself emperor, Beethoven famously scratched the name Bonaparte off the title page of his score and renamed it Eroica, or Heroism, a symphony to celebrate the memory of a great man. This was the first piece of symphonic music that captured an array of human experiences and emotions, that transitioned Beethoven from the classical aesthetics of clarity and proportion into the grittiness and the ambiguities that began defining a new era of romanticism in music. Through courage and ingenuity, Beethoven persevered in the face of adversity and will forever be music's hero. Revolutions bring forth heroes when they stand up to their oppressors. On December 1st, 1955, a hero was born when Rosa Parks sat down and did not move out of her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama public bus. Parks's bravery led to the Montgomery bus boycott and a ruling that bus segregation was unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment that guaranteed all citizens equal protections under the law. The work of Parks and the many brave heroes from the American Civil Rights Movement continue to this day. Activists, politicians, and citizens are still standing up to the inequities that continue to affect many Americans. We're featuring one more composer on this program, the violinist, composer, and activist Daniel Bernard Roumain, and his piece entitled Clap Your Hands, which is the second movement of his string quartet number 5 entitled Parks, after Rosa Parks. Let's listen to his musical depiction of the persistence, grit, and strength still needed in the fight against racism. Here's a short excerpt from the first movement entitled I Made Up My Mind Not to Move, performed by our Philharmonic String Quartet. Later this month, we will be releasing videos of the full first movement of this quartet, as well as the entire movements from the 2 Beethoven piano sonatas and the trio for violin, cello, and piano, played by our fabulous Philharmonic musicians. From the almost forgotten legacy of Joseph Bologna, Chevalier de Saint-Georges, to the revolutionary music of Beethoven, to the present-day activism of Daniel Bernard Roumain, artists have and will always reflect the times in which they live, giving us their insight into the human experience. In other words, If you want to know how people felt at any point in history, just listen to their music or study their art, and we can more clearly see how deeply connected we all are. If we are intent on becoming a more just and equal society, we must unmute marginalized voices, amplify their insights, and listen. I recently had the distinct pleasure of meeting and talking with Ruth and Horace Littlejohn. Here are some of the highlights from our fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, Mr. and Mrs. Littlejohn, for joining us today. We're absolutely honored and delighted that you took the time to speak with us about something we care so much about, our community, Spartanburg. You are native to this community. You grew up here. I know that you left in around 1975 for a very distinguished career in the Air Force, and then you came back in 2006. And 2007, excuse me. And now you are serving in our local politics here. Mr. Littlejohn, you're on the Public Works Commission.
Yes, Commission on Public Works.
Exactly. And Mrs. Littlejohn, you are on the City Council. So you both grew up here in Spartanburg. You were born here in Spartanburg? No.
I was born in Roanoke, Virginia, and moved here, or my family moved here when I was maybe 3 years old.
I was born in Woodruff, South Carolina, and I lived there until I was 13 years old. I enjoyed that life, but my grandmother was a sharecropper.
And when you were children, you were growing up in a segregated society.
Yes.
What are you comfortable sharing about that experience with us?
When I moved to Spartanburg, well, I would tell you this, I never encountered racism when I was in Woodruff, South Carolina. It was like a one big family. And then when I came to Spartanburg, I remember standing out to catch the bus and the white kids going by spitting. But the first time, and I don't use the N-word, I call it for what it is. The first time that I heard the word nigger was when I moved to Spartanburg. I had never heard that before in my life until I moved to Spartanburg. And I know you would think that is strange because I was down in Woodruff, but we were like a close knit. Me and my friend had been riding our bicycle all out that day, and it was very hot. It was very hot, so we decided, oh, we can go in the goodie shop now and sit down and have a sandwich because their hamburgers and hot dogs were always so good, and you could go there and order something, but you had to get it from the back. You had to get it from the back through the years. So now we felt as though this was a good time to go in and sit down to have a burger and a Coke. And we were sitting at the booth, sitting in the booth, and we were waiting for somebody to come to help us. There was an older white woman behind the counter, and there was a younger white man standing. And they were just standing there looking at us, and we were waiting on some service. And so finally Betty asked, my friend asked if we could get some service, and that was when the older white lady went in the back and came out with a sawed-off shotgun. And Betty and I got up, and we left because we knew that if we had said something or we had resisted, because she could have killed us and said we tried to do something and nothing would have been done. So we left, Betty and I left, and we never told our parents. Neither of us told our parents. I did not tell my mother up until, oh my goodness, I was grown and married, because I was afraid. I knew my mother, how she protected her children. And I knew that if I had said something to my mother probably would have gone down there and she would have gotten killed. And so I did not say anything. I did not say anything up until I was grown. And I told my mother. And Betty didn't tell her parents because she knew her father would have gone down there.
If you look at those things that hurt and painful, it's walking past a school, and I lived on the north side of town. There was a school, elementary school, less than a block from my house, and it was a white school. And we had to walk past that school to go to Cumberland Street, which is right down here behind Walford College, and that's where I went. And you know, you encountered when the white kids passed you as you were walking or whatever, the use of the term nigger and stuff like that. So you know, and I look at it in reflection as that was the law of the land. We grew up in segregation and stuff like that. So those things you endured. They weren't pleasant, but you endured. And the one incident that happened that really was painful to me was as growing up on the north side, I went to work for a white store owner who lived like less than a mile from our house. And so he came down to ask my grandmother. He said, "Hey, I need someone to work for me, one of your boys to work for me." And being the oldest, I got the nod to go. And so I started working at this grocery store, delivering groceries and learning different things. And the owners, you know, I guess he said, "Okay, I'm going to teach this young man something." I guess I was like 13, 14 years old. So he was teaching me how to carve meat, you know, and stuff like that. And so I was back in the shop there carving meat or cutting the fat off the meat. And so his son, who was on the police force, came in. He would stop by occasionally. But on this particular day, he came back, he had used the bathroom, and he saw me back there cutting meat. And he said, "Nigga, take your hands off the meat." You know, and I'm like, it just really, I just stopped there, didn't know what to do. And being young at that time and working, I'm like, okay. And so when he left, I went back to doing what his father had told me to do, you know. And I use that story sometimes because in my profession and dealing with equal rights and equal opportunity, to share how those type of words really hurt. And as Ruth was saying, today we try to cover it up by using the N-word. There is no such thing as an N-word. And you will never understand the pain and agony that a person has to go through when you are called that word. But you know, overall, we live in a very close-knit community on the north side. And we shared so much of the community with whites. It's just funny how it was divided because, let's see, if we're going down this road, on the right side, black families live, and on the left side, white families live. On the corner,
Across the street from each other.
yeah, right across the street from each other, and we have a lot. And people, that's why I say, you know, we respected each other, and there was really never anything where we were at each other's throat or anything like that. We just accepted the fact that this is the way life is and stuff like that. The community that I grew up in was a blue-collar community. We had teachers, brick masons, you know, and this type of thing. So my whole thing of growing up was basically just getting out of, not necessarily getting out of Spartanburg. I didn't think about it because our parents always said education, education, education. And so that's what we were centered on. And we just took life as it came. Those type of instances, you know, growing up impacted me in such a way that when I went to the military, one of the things going through the military in regards to discipline is yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, whatever. And I just felt I could never say sir to not just anyone, but specifically whites. And I'm like, okay, captain, okay, colonel, whatever. But never use the term sir because no one in my growing up referred to my father as sir and this type of thing. So those are some of the things that carry me.
The words have never hurt me. You know, the people would use the word gushing, saying a nigger, gush, or whatever. I am glad that I was raised by a mother and father, especially a grandmother, because we lived in my grandmother's house, and she always said, words do not hurt. Because when someone could call you a name that's displeasing to you, to shake it off, let you move on. Because whatever they're calling you, but you have to always assume that it takes one to know one. And so, to shake it off, so the words don't bother me. And then, sir and ma'am, I was raised up, I had to call everybody sir and ma'am. I worked in real estate for 23 years in 3 different states. Everybody who got in and out of my car, I don't care if they were young enough to be my children, it was sir and ma'am. I think that that was one of the things that helped me to be successful gushing my career, because I just respected everyone.
Are there any stories from the 60s, from the 70s that, whether it's active participation or just what things that you observed that began to give you hope in terms of a brighter future for America?
And for me during that time, things that stuck out during the 60s were the radicals that evolved out of the civil rights area. The music that portrayed some of the hardships and this type thing that came out of that. Some of the books, the literature, Francis Fanon and Huey Newton and Angela Davis, and the fact that at that point in the 60s, it seems like that's when African Americans, the culture began to take on a change to the afro and the way we dressed and stuff like that, to show that we were proud of who we were in this type of thing. So it sort of enlightened me as to then I guess that would maybe be the time when I began to maybe loosen up, speak out and stuff like that. Because after going to Livingstone College, which is again HBCU, which was the law of the land at that time, and it just gave me an opportunity to speak out. I just felt coming alive and beginning to see how I would fit in this thing in regards to change. I just think that it was a time where people, black and white, opened their eyes and say, we need to change. But fast forward to today, I'm very disappointed because we've gone through all this change, and when I look back and I look here, there's not been that type of change other than some tangible stuff like, I can go to the movies, I can drink out of a water fountain, I can do this. But we really hadn't embraced each other to the point where we're accepting of others in this type of thing. And some of the things that came out of the civil rights areas in regards to inequities and stuff like that, while they were overt then, they were becoming covert now. And I'm just sort of disappointed now that we're going through the same thing today. Right. That we have to have Black Lives Matter and the destruction that's going on in current protests to say that we got to get beyond and the inequities and stuff like that. And what was all the strife and rioting back in the 60s? That was bringing attention, and we really haven't grown.
Yeah, it's like we've been here before. And now we're doing the same things, doing the same things.
Right.
What do you think? How do we break that cycle?
Well, to me, you can put legislation in, as we did in the past, and it hasn't changed anything. But until a person changes their heart to accept other people and recognize that God made us all and made us as a rainbow. And doing my studies, there was a term in regards to the melting pot. Throw the melting pot, because we're not going to melt.
Right.
So a new term came about in regards to our society is more like a salad, and we need to appreciate you because you bring something unique to the salad. Her because it brings something unique to the salad, and we've not really gotten to that point. When you talk about society, everybody, you're going to have to be one. And we're never going to be one, So we just have to learn to appreciate and embrace each other's differences. Doing these changes from the 60s to the 70s to the 90s came another term, and we need to tolerate each other. I don't want to tolerate you. I want to get to know you.
Yeah, embrace you.
Toleration means, well, okay, when I go to work, I got to accept, Stefan as, okay, I got to work with him. But when I go back home, I'm going to curse him, I'm going to disavow him, only dislike him, and stuff like that. And that's not really an acceptance. So we got to go beyond tolerance. We got to go to embracing and accepting each other and appreciating each other. We just haven't gotten there because it comes down to what's in your heart. That's what it's
and what we're taught.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, and what we're taught.
This is, you know, I believe, like you do, that we don't come into this world feeling one way or the other about the color of somebody's skin. It's how that person makes us feel and how they treat us and care for us that impacts how we feel about them.
That's right. But when my time comes to die, I don't want it said that I hated anyone. I try and love everybody.
One of the pieces we're playing is written by a living African-American composer by the name of Daniel Bernard Roumain. He's a violinist, composer, performer, a really quite sensational human being all around. And he's written this piece called Parks, after Rosa Parks. And the movement we're playing is entitled Clap Your Hands. And it's a fairly intense piece of music. Do you remember the moment when Rosa Parks refused to get up?
I remember the story because of Rosa Parks, you know, when she refused to get up. And I really was proud of her for doing that. I was really proud of her because I remember a time when I used to ride the bus, but way before we got married, I used to get on the bus, and we had to go to the back of the bus to sit. And so I was so proud that she had that courage to sit there and not move.
Yeah. And it's just a matter of enough is enough.
Enough is
And
enough.
finally, you know, it's like, okay, I can't take it anymore. And I think that type of bravery, if you will, heroism, if you will, for a person to do that really opens up for those of us who may not have had that courage to say, yeah, okay, it's time. It's time.
Are there individuals or movements or what are some of the things that give you hope, that inspire you, that maybe we will be able to break down these walls and be a more just and more closely knit society?
I'm still hanging on to the work of Martin Luther King. As I said earlier, I'm disappointed that in this day and time we are where we are. But it was the likes of Martin Luther King Jr., John F. Kennedy, Rosa Parks. These are the people that have inspired me and inspired the world. And I'm just really, when you say accelerated, and why are we just accelerating? You know, this is just seemingly a new wave. And an example of how we failed in regards to civil rights and equality and stuff that we're here in 2020, and now we're trying to jettison further. And I'm just flabbergasted that here we are
Again,
starting all over again. You know what it seems like. So, but it's Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, John F. Kennedy, all of the heroes during the 60s still linger in our mind, and we're still trying to live up to what they fought for. We haven't done it.
What gives me hope is the young people. The young people of today, they don't seem to focus so much on color. You know, you see them like gathering. It's more of a united front right now, you know, with the young people. I am seeing the young people who are gathering because they are loving one another and are not seemingly focused so much on what color someone is. And that gives me hope, because I do believe that the young people are going to be the ones that's going to bring about change in this world. They are going to bring about the change that is much needed.
Thank you for listening and watching this video. On behalf of the Spartanburg Philharmonic's musicians, board, staff, and myself, we are deeply honored to continue sharing music and stories with with this remarkable community.